before. If you haven't, we'll talk a little bit about what a premortem is, but that's not the entire focus of this episode. Briefly, a premortem is effectively trying to find the problems from a different vantage point. You're imagining that you are yourself in the future, and you're looking back on a project or some kind of effort, something that you are in real life getting ready to embark on. Now, you're imagining this future self looking back in hindsight and finding out what went wrong or right. Premortem doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing, although the mortem portion of it kind of sounds negative. Some people call the positive version of this a pre-parade. But nevertheless, the exercise is essentially the same. You're imagining what you would look back on to diagnose a problem, to diagnose what went totally wrong. And this practice is very common in startups. In fact, it's common in a lot of industries now. It is recommended by people like Richard Thaler and Danny Kahneman. And the basic idea is that we have this interesting ability, if we use prospective hindsight. This is basically fast forward and looking back. Exactly what we've already described. We have this unique ability to see things from a different angle. Some of this comes from the social kind of prompting to find a good, bad reason. In other words, you're finding the most insightful problems that could go wrong. So this kind of flips the normal social intent of being optimistic. So now there is some kind of reward at a social level if you come up with the most insightful or the most likely, the most interesting way that things can go wrong. There was a study back in 2010 done by, and hopefully I see these names correctly, Veinot, Klein, and Wiggins. They compared the premortem to other methods using 178 college students, and they posed a hypothetical situation, and the premortem reduced overconfidence. All right, so that was the main effect that they measured, that it reduced overconfidence better than the other methods. This is very important because as humans, we are prone to overconfidence. And in fact, if you are kind of excluding yourself from this group, that may actually be a signal of your own overconfidence. That said, I want to talk to you about a very specific use of premortem in today's episode, and it's going to be for your career. But first, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Neo4j. Not all data is created equal. If your code is getting dragged down by joins and long query times and super complex kinds of queries that you need the SQL expert in the company to come and debug to figure out why it's not returning the row you expected to return, the problem might just be your choice of database. You can try simplifying it with graphs. A graph database lets you model data the way it looks in the real world, instead of forcing it into rows and columns. Stop asking relational databases to do more than they were made for, which, by the way, relational databases can absolutely solve many problems. But if you're finding yourself wondering, maybe this isn't the right tool, graphs can work well for use cases with lots of data connections like supply chain, fraud detection, real-time analytics, and generative AI. With Neo4j, you can code in your favorite programming language and against any driver. Plus, it's easy to integrate into your existing tech stack. People are solving some of the world's biggest problems with graphs, and now it's your turn. Visit neo4j.com/developer to get started. That's NEO4j, the number 4, NEO4j.com/developer. Thanks again to Neo4j for sponsoring today's episode of Developer Tea. What What do you wish you could have told your younger self? This is a way of practicing hindsight, although it's not necessarily prospective hindsight. There are usually an abundance of answers to this question for any given person. I wish I could have told myself X, Y, or Z about my career or about school or about that thing, that relationship that I had. It's worthwhile to do this exercise, to get into the mindset before doing what I'm going to ask you to do next. So spend 2 or 3 minutes imagining what you would have told yourself 5 or 10 years ago. Now, the next part of the exercise, I'm going to ask you to give yourself advice from the outsider's perspective for today. Now, what we've done here by having you do the first bit of advice is I've tried to prime you a little bit. I'm trying to prime you so that you don't focus too much on tactical advice, things that you're dealing with in this moment. Instead, you're trying to tap into that kind of wisdom style advice. I use the word wisdom here to really just mean these larger scale, more comprehensively important things to you, things that you actually care about in 5 or 10 years from now. Now, I want you to imagine yourself in 5 or 10 years. But this time, instead of providing yourself advice from the outsider's perspective, I want you to perform the premortem. And specifically, for the sake of this exercise, focus it on your career, although you can do this exercise beyond that. Now, the reason I want you to focus it on your career is because there's a couple of outcomes that in doing this exercise I had that you might share that may just be tactical advice for you to take from this episode. But hopefully you come up with your own bits and pieces of a premortem for your own career. So if you're imagining some goal you have, or maybe you're imagining trying to follow the advice that your wise self just gave you, what is most likely to keep you from doing that? What kind of thing did you fail to do, or what kind of thing, random effect that you didn't have total control over, came in the way of you progressing in your career the way you had hoped? Now, here's the reason that we do this. We're not just going to limit this to the things that you can control. And the reason for that is because if you're doing a prospective hindsight, you're able to see, in some regard, the risks that you might have otherwise not prepared for. In other words, even though you may not be able to control those external risks actually happening, you can prepare for them better if you anticipate them. So this prospective hindsight is an anticipation exercise. You're anticipating what kinds of things should I hedge my risks for? How can I prepare for those unknowns a little bit better? Now, we wouldn't judge your decision-making in hindsight, but we can hone our decision-making in advance. If we have some idea of the threats, even though we can't control them, we can make a plan to mitigate the risks associated with those threats. So, of course, it makes sense to look at all of these risks, maybe even provide more information or categorization around them, like things that I can't control, as we just mentioned, that you may want to mitigate the risks of, things that I can control. So why did we fail on those particular things? Maybe we failed to develop the correct habits, or we didn't set ourselves up for success in some other way. So what you're doing here is you're kind of creating this, in this moment at least, a kind of messy map for yourself. You've recognized your path by looking back and providing that advice to your younger self. You've kind of primed for that wise vision rather than focusing on the small stuff. And then you've given yourself the advice in the present. Hopefully that priming has done its job. And your premortem, looking back on the next 5 to 10 years in your career life and wondering, what went wrong. This can be an enlightening exercise at the very least. The kinds of things you should have on this list, by the way, you don't necessarily have to use those big vision things, but I want you to think on the longer term scale. I'll give you an example from my personal experience. When I look back at my career, one of the biggest regrets that I have which this is a hindsight rather than a prospective hindsight, one of the biggest regrets that I have is that I didn't do a great job of gathering evidence for my own worth. So let me clarify what I mean here. If you go and you get a resume review from any industry leader, myself included, honestly, one of the first things that I would tell you, one of the first things that any hiring manager is going to tell you, is that your resume should have hard data for each of the jobs that you're in. Some kind of metric that shows your impact. The words that you use only tell part of the story, but if you can back up what you did with hard facts, hard data, then you're much more likely to garner some legitimacy from your resume. And this is something that I did not do well throughout my career so far. I have not done a good job of gathering good facts, of gathering good hard data about the impact that I've had at the companies that I've worked at. So I look forward in my career, in my kind of prospective hindsight, my premortem in my career, and I would consider that a future failure. I failed to change that behavior. I failed to go back and mine out the things that I could to point to hard facts about my participation in a given company. So your list may have similarly small things. These are small things that can make a huge difference in your career. Or you may be focused on larger behavioral things. For example, you may look back and say, I am unhappy with the way I spent my time in my career because, let's say, I wish I had worked at a company that I aligned more with their values, or I wish I'd worked with people that I had more fun with. These are things that you can provide yourself the roadmap on. And this is one way, by the way, that you can develop your sense of values and of your own purpose. We've talked about this on the show before, that purpose sounds like this mystical, massive thing. But in fact, your purpose can be very simple and it can evolve. And so by understanding, how you imagine you may fail in your career and opening up the definition of that so that you can define failure as being unhappy at the end of the 5 or 10 year stint. And you may be able to identify areas that you're currently ignoring. Maybe you don't have a pathway to solving that problem yet because you didn't realize that it was going to be a problem in the first place. I encourage you to practice this kind of prospective hindsight. Whether you do it through this specific method or follow my whole exercise here, or if you just do it on a regular basis in a more informal way. Hopefully this will give you some kind of direction that may otherwise be a little bit harder to parse out, a little bit harder to identify just through your own intuition. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of Developer Tea. Thank you again to today's sponsor, Neo4j. If your code is getting dragged down by endless joins and long query times, you can try simplifying the complexity with graphs. With Neo4j, you can code in your favorite programming language and against any driver. Head over to neo4j.com/developer to see what graphs can do for you. That's NEO, the number 4, the letter J.com/developer. neo4j.com/developer. If you enjoyed today's discussion, I'd like to invite you to subscribe in whatever podcasting app you currently use. And the other ask is a very simple one. If you are enjoying this show, maybe it's provided some value to you, whether just this episode or maybe one of the other hundreds of episodes that we've published, the ask is for you to share that. Share it by leaving a review. The most impactful review platform that you can participate on right now is iTunes. So leave a review in whatever platform you prefer. If you don't have a preference, leaving a review in iTunes is a huge help to the show. It helps other people like you find and decide to listen to Developer Tea. Thanks so much for listening. And until next time, enjoy your tea.